This past Saturday was the 40th anniversary of the Miracle on Ice. And Stephen, it's hard to comprehend, but it's been that long.
I know it is. I mean, I'm dating myself here, but I was a senior in high school when that took place. And it's one of those moments that, again, we're talking about it 40 years later. And to me, it still is amazing as it was when it happened. And I know a lot of people that may not have grown up with him. They might have thought, well, if it was a championship game, like a finals per se, then maybe it was great. But even though it wasn't, it just the whole idea, the U.S. was not supposed to win that game. I mean, the Russians, it would have been like, I don't know, the Patriots playing a college team or something. I mean, they were that dominant back then. And the U.S. team just wasn't. It was just one of those improbable wins that pushed the U.S. forward. And really, I think at least at that particular time, it put hockey on the map in the United States. I mean, hockey was around, but it didn't have quite the popularity that it did when the U.S. team won that game. And it put Mike Eruzione and, Herb Brooks and all those guys really on the map as far as recognizable names. Everybody suddenly knew who they were. And it really made advancements for the sport of hockey in this country.
I was 8 years old, I should say, when it happened. So it's definitely a little melancholy to realize, holy cow, you're 48 years old and you're just about the youngest person who would remember this moment, which is without question the most magical moment in sports history in the United States. In my mind, and forget the geopolitical stuff, because as a kid, obviously I can't wrap my head around that, but all I knew was that we beat the most dominant hockey team ever assembled with a bunch of college players. I mean, they had a professional all-star team of veterans who'd lost one game in the last 5 Olympics and hadn't lost since 1968. And we just lost an exhibition to them 2 weeks earlier, 10-3. And, Stephen, the previous November, Team USA lost a game to the Houston Apollos, just in the city of Houston here.
Right.
Which was our local minor league team.
Well, and I remember seeing the Russians come on a tour in the 70s, back when the World Hockey Association was around, and they played the Houston Aeros, which, the Aeros kind of had a rebirth several times in Houston. But this was in the 70s with the WHA. And, the Aeros were a good team. I mean, they won the league championship 2 straight years. In fact, I believe it was the year of their second championship, and the Russians just steamrolled over them like they were a high school team. So that just goes to show you how dominant they were back then. And as you said, the U.S., they didn't have NHL players playing then in the All-Star game. It was a bunch of college players going up against a bunch of seasoned professionals.
Yeah, and I'll say that again because I think I whizzed right by it. But like I said, they lost an exhibition 2 weeks earlier to the Soviet team, 10-3. 10-3 is, in hockey terms, just a reminder, because I know I'm talking to a lot of Houston sports fans, maybe don't follow hockey as much, but just think of it like soccer, 10-3. It looked like the Bad News Bears out there. Really, Steve.
Yeah. It'd be like 18-3 in baseball. I mean, just 10-3 in hockey, especially then. And now today, the offense, there's a little more offense in hockey now than there used to be. I mean, back then, 10-3 in hockey, it would have been like, I don't know, 20-3 in baseball or something. That's what I would compare it to, because it was just unheard of.
Before I get to a really cool story from an interview that we did a while back regarding the game, a couple of fun facts I found. First of all, team captain Mike Eruzione, who of course had the game-winning goal, never played a hockey game after the Olympics.
That's right, he sure did.
And Eruzione in Italian means eruption, which, Stephen, is fitting because that's what he created all over the country.
Yeah. Wow, I didn't know.
The Foo Fighters' Dave Grohl was 11 years old at the time. He loved goalie Jim Craig so much that after the Miracle on Ice, he found the phone numbers of all the Jim Craigs in that area, phoned them up, and congratulated them.
Wow, that's pretty cool. You take more courage than I've got, that's for sure.
And then the night before the game, Jim Craig was playing a game of Centipede, and I just read this. I couldn't believe this. He was playing a game of Centipede, which for you kids out there, it's basically the Nintendo or Madden or whatever at the time. He was playing it at the Olympic Village with one of the Soviet players.
Yeah, I think I do remember hearing that story, which is pretty intriguing.
Last one I've got for you is when Team USA left the locker room to face the Soviets, they passed hundreds of telegrams that had been pasted on the hallways from people across the country. One of them was from a woman from Texas, and it simply read, "Beat those commie bastards."
Ooh, all right. Well, there's some good bulletin board motivation for you.
Oh, man. There's so many great stories out of it. We have this amazing one from the Houston Sports Talk vault from 5 years ago, when an old-time Houston sports radio legend, John O'Reilly, had just passed away. And O'Reilly was somebody that I grew up listening to. And for those too young to remember, he spent nearly 2 decades in Houston at KTRH 740 AM, KSEV 700 AM, and KPRC 950. He had 2 stints on the Oilers radio team from 83 to 85 and from 89 to 91, the last 3 alongside Bum Phillips. And when John O'Reilly passed away on Houston Sports Talk, I spoke with his colleague on 740, Tom Franklin. And here's the story Franklin tells from the Miracle on Ice.
It's funny, and I don't know that a whole lot of people know about it, but everybody remembers the Al Michaels statement, "Do you believe in miracles?" Yes, at the end of the ball game as time expired in the win over the Russians.
11 seconds. You've got 10 seconds. The countdown going on right now. Morrow up to Schultz. 5 seconds left in the game. Do you believe in miracles? Yes! Unbelievable.
And what happened was that John was working on the radio call for ABC at that particular point in time, and the booths were side by side with the TV booth, and they got to a commercial break in the 3rd period after Mike Eruzione had scored the go-ahead goal, and Mike leaned over to Al Michaels, and he had known Al from their dealings on the West Coast, and he looked over at Al and he says, "Do you believe in miracles?" And Al would eventually wound up incorporating that into the finish that everybody knows about, but John may have been the guy behind that.
So John leaned over to him and said that, huh?
Yeah, during a commercial break, leaned from one booth to the next one and said to Al Michaels, after the U.S. had taken the lead in the 3rd period, it's like, "Do you believe in miracles? Could this really happen?" And Al became famous for it.
Maybe it got in Al's head and he forgot about it, because I always hear Al tell this story. The only thing I could think about at the end of the game was miraculous, and that came to my head, and that's why the call happened.
Well, there was something there, but the way John recounted that story, and this was a long time ago. We're talking 30 years ago now. After he first got there to KTRH, this was one of the first stories he told me, was that he said, "Yeah, I leaned over the booth and told Michael that midway through the 3rd period after the U.S. took the lead, he said, 'Do you believe in miracles?' And look what he did with it." I can't, I wasn't there, so I don't know which guy is right, but I'll take the word of John O'Reilly on this one, because I've known him for so long and he wouldn't steer me wrong.
Well, who do you believe, Stephen?
It's interesting. Man, you just sent chills up my spine just hearing that call again. Every time I hear it, I've heard it, probably 100 times, and it still gives me the shivers, just in a good way. Well, I think, as we just heard, 9 times out of 10, when these calls are made, they aren't planned in advance. I just don't think it's something you can really plan for. But indirectly, it obviously was planted in his head. Who's to say that he might not have subconsciously, it just came out. But I don't know. Since I'm a Houston guy, I'd like to think that John O'Reilly had a hand in it, wouldn't you?
I don't know. It's hard for me to believe that Al's just kind of because I've heard him tell this story a number of different times, but why would John O'Reilly make this whole thing up? I mean, if Tom trusts the guy and he worked with he worked with John O'Reilly for years. And you talk about, you still get the goosebumps. I still get, I get emotion. I'll listen to that call. And it doesn't. You said no matter how many times, you're right. I get choked up. I was watching the story about the Miracle on Ice. There's a great story. I think it's HBO did it, and I posted it up on Twitter and up on our Facebook page. That the whole story about the miracle. And I was watching it again and again. I mean, I get emotional. I mean, and there's tears coming down my eyes and everything.
Well, if you think about what was happening at the time, the U.S., of course, that was the year that they were boycotting. And then the Russians, and 4 years later in Los Angeles, they boycotted. So it's so many things were happening at the time, what was going on. And it brings together so many different things. It just makes it all the more, I guess, inspiring, emotional. And I'm not trying to get political, but I'm just saying, knowing what was going on at the time and just the odds against them doing this, that's really what it is for me. It comes back to what were the chances of them winning this? 1,000 to 1? I mean, look, if somebody had placed a bet on that, how much money would have won on that game? Just, if they had bet with the U.S.
Yeah, part of it, I'm sure for me, is there was an innocence about it because, like I said, I was 8 years old. Part of it, I feel like there was just there's something about it that you just don't see today, which there was this lack of cynicism. And it was such this black and white thing. It was the good guys and the good hats and the bad guys and the black hats and the whole, you had all of that stuff going on, and you see it. And, the words, of a miracle. And, there's something about that in life. I'll tell you a quick story, Stephen, just to get a little personal with this. And an interesting story that happened to me is many years ago. I was about 26 years old, and I'm just fallen in love with this girl. The girl I fell in love with is an Austrian girl. I had fallen in love with her, and it was just super early in the relationship. We're maybe a couple of weeks into the relationship, and she looks over to me and she says, and this is like, I think we might have just, or she might have just said that she'd loved me or something. This has never happened to me. It's very overwhelming. And she turned over to me and she goes, "Do you believe in miracles?"
Oh, my goodness.
I could not explain to her, because she's, of course, not from the United States and she wasn't much of a sports fan. So she has no idea what that phrase means to me. But, I could tell her, in fact, I do. In fact, I do.
Let me play you the Al Michaels call. I'll show you. Well, that's an interesting story, but that I don't know. I'm sure we'd heard the term or the phrase before Al Michaels made that call. But boy, afterwards, every time I hear it, it's just, what's the first thing you think of? It's Al Michaels.
Yeah, and again, you want to go back to these moments where we don't have much today, Stephen. There's not this cynicism attached. Even as soon as a moment happens, it's like, well. But what about this and what about that? And I mean, we thought we had one of those moments a couple of years ago with the Astros, and it's just and that's that's all gone. That's all disappeared. So it's so rare that it just never happens like that. And you just knew something. And I talk about it because I know that it's getting further and further in the distance, and there's people that just haven't didn't get to experience it. And maybe you saw the movie with Kurt Russell, which was really good. And it got a lot of that stuff right, Stephen, but it's hard to get it all across.
Yeah, it is. And, this is so much bigger than a league championship where one U.S. team beats another. I mean, this is one country beating another. And as I said, back then, the political climate, especially between the U.S. and the Soviets, was very tense. The Cold War was still very deeply going on. It was, 8 years later that we finally started to see some breakthrough. But back then, it was still very intense. So it just meant so much more to us as a country than, say, a team winning the World Series or a football team winning the Super Bowl or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, when I was a kid at that time, and you remember this, Stephen, you had the Iranian hostage situation.
That's right. It was going on around that same time as well.
And yes. So the country was, there was this constant dread as you turned on the TV every night, and they had this story. It would be on Nightline. Nightline was on, I might still be going on. But I haven't watched Nightline in ages. But it was one of your news sources, and it was on after the news every night on ABC and on Nightline every night. they were going to talk about that Iranian hostage situation. And when those guys got out, the American hostages from Iran, one of the guys told the story that they showed us the American, I guess, I don't know if it was the military or the government or whatever, they showed us a film of what had happened, in the 14 months or whatever that they were in captivity. And that film concluded with the Miracle on Ice. And, he said there was applause, and it was just like, he said, of all the things you missed, that was huge. But at the same time, he goes, it gave us it gave them such joy to see that.
Well, I don't remember which month it was, Robert, but of course it was the same year, around the same time, that the U.S. announced that they would be boycotting the Summer Olympics in Moscow in 1980. And of course, you have to remember, back then, the Winter and Summer Olympics took place in the same year. So now, again, I don't remember if it was before or after the Miracle on Ice, but it is still, there was a lot of controversy raging about that going on with the Summer Olympics. And so just so many things added up, and it's like it was meant to happen for so many reasons other than just, one hockey team facing off against another.
And lost in all of that, and that when we remember back to those Olympics, was one of the most amazing things you'll never see this again. And it's Eric Heiden. Do you remember much about the Eric Heiden story?
Yeah, I do remember. I mean, I remember how, great he was in winning the medal and everything, but the story is still kind of vague in my mind.
This guy, he's a speed skater, but he wins a gold medal in 5 different speed skating events.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
It wasn't just like, he won it wasn't like a bunch of, he's doing all the fast races like you see in track and field. He basically wins 5 gold medals from the shortest event, to the longest event in speed skating. And he was a doctor. If you don't know,
that's right. Yeah,
the guy was a doctor too, and it was almost like the equivalent of you're doing track and field, and he wins the 100. He wins the 400. He wins the 800
and the mile.
Yeah, and he wins the 10,000 meter. It was that ridiculous.
Yeah, that is pretty interesting. How I just forgot. I'd honestly forgotten how many medals he won. I knew it was multiple amount, but that was yet another. I mean, the Winter Olympics in 1980, you have to say, was ours if you're the USA.
Yeah, I think he was an orthopedic surgeon or something like that.
I think that's right.
That was the other big story, and really. It was that Olympics where, for me, and I'm sure a lot of people, you almost fell in love with that event. And it was 8 years coming off of, what had happened in Munich and the really sad and awful story that had happened there. And to have this, it kind of reinvigorated people's love for the Olympics and how special it was between Eric Heiden and the Miracle on Ice. But I definitely wanted to talk about that. I don't want the 40th anniversary to go without people kind of looking back and seeing what an amazing thing that was.
Absolutely. And it's just, again, it's one of those things that, 100 years from now, people will still be referring to it. None of us will be alive, or maybe in the 100-year anniversary, it's still going to be something that will forever be in sports lore.
You're listening to Houston Sports Talk.